Aloha, everybody. Welcome in. Aloha and welcome. And thank you for joining us today to NPC's April 3rd, Thursday. Before we get started, just a quick note on questions. Please feel free to drop any questions you have throughout the presentation into the chat. At the end, we will have time to address any questions in the chat. And at that time, you can also unmute and ask those questions for yourself. Today's session is entitled Empowering Resilience Across Local Communities, Oregon Resilient Hubs, and ESF 6 Evaluation Program. This presentation will explore how communities can strengthen resilience through local coordination, planning, and evaluation efforts, with a focus on lessons learned from Oregon's Resilient Hub initiatives and mass care planning efforts. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Paul Manson, a research assistant professor at the Center for Public Service at Portland State University. Dr. Manson brings valuable experience in community resilience, public service, and applied research. And we're so excited to have him share his insights today. With that, thank you, Dr. Manson. Over to you.
Thanks, Amy. Appreciate it. And thanks for having me for this session. I'm going to pull my slides up here real quick and get us kicked off. This is a really fun program that we had a chance to participate in. And before I jump into the presentation, just a little bit about myself and the Center for Public Service. As Amy mentioned, I'm with the Center for Public Service at Portland State University. And I like to think of us as, if you're familiar with the Agricultural Extension Service model, we're the extension service for local and state government here in Oregon. So we're housed in the Hatfield School of Government, and state agencies, cities, counties come to us with policy questions, applied research questions. And what I'm going to share with you today is an example of one of those, where the Oregon Department of Human Services, our human services agency here in Oregon, contracted with us to support them on a number of initiatives around the Oregon Resilience Hubs and Network program, and then as well on mass care planning. But we also were hired to do program evaluation, a little bit about that in this presentation. So this is part of what we call our co-production model of research.
Paul, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure you're sharing the presenter slide, not the presentation slide. I wasn't sure if that was intentional. I just wanted to let you know.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I quickly clicked on the wrong one. There we go. So the right one should come up now. There. Thanks. I appreciate it. It takes a team. So what I'll share with you today are a couple of stories that play out here. And I always start with chutes and ladders because I don't know where we're trying to co-create new research findings, but that also have questions.
Paul, I'm so sorry to interrupt you again. Connection's a little spotty, Paul.
Is the 20 wildfire season here in Oregon. And
Paul, can you hear me?
So that puts me in trouble.
Paul?
Let me see here. Give me a second.
Paul, are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe if you want to turn off your video, the connection's a glitchy and the presentation hasn't loaded yet. You've frozen. Oh no, he was just fine up until now. So Paul, I'm not sure what happened. Hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully you can get back online. But I was going to share this at the end of this presentation, but I will do it now while Paul gets back online. So speaking of resilience, I wanted to share just a brief update on what's happening with Super Typhoon Sinlaku and its impacts across Guam and CNMI. Just down to Typhoon Sinlaku made landfall in the northern Mariana Islands on April 14th, with the eye passing over Tinian and Saipan. The winds reached up to 145 miles per hour before landfall. I've also heard 150. So with the power being down, a lot of those wind stations weren't able to record. But the storm has since moved north, but its impacts are continuing, although decreasing. The impacts are decreasing within 6 to 12 hours. Winds, rain, and coastal inundation affected the region with 5 to 8 feet in Saipan and Tinian, 3 to 5 feet in Rota, and up to 3 feet in Guam. Saipan and Tinian sustained the most widespread damage. Structures are damaged or completely destroyed. Debris blocking roads, power, water, and communications are disrupted. Guam experienced outages and infrastructure impacts as well, and Chuuk reported just rainfall and localized flooding. In Sinamai, offices are closed and a shelter-in-place order is in effect. In Guam, police are conducting patrols and the National Guard is supporting traffic control and debris removal. Shelters are remaining open across the affected region. The ports in Sinamai are remaining closed, but in Guam, the port was closed earlier but has since been open and the airport is operating with limited flights. In summary, the Saipan or Sinlaku typhoon caused widespread disruption across Sinamai with the greatest impacts in Saipan and Tinian. Response and restoration efforts are ongoing. So I know that was a lot to talk, but I did make a typed report that I will share in the chat. So feel free to read that. And Paul is back, so hopefully his connection is better and you guys can read this after he is done. Paul, are you ready?
I am, and apologies for that. It's the worst thing when I come down to campus, and it's a worse connection than at home.
It's all good. Like you said, it takes a team. I just did my report on the typhoon. So if you want to share your screen, maybe turn off your camera.
Just give me another, same thing, you did a great job. Just interrupt me if it acts odd here, and I'll keep going.
Okay. So far, so good.
All right, apologies, everyone. But it's perfect that you had this content to fill right in and get the update. So let me back up to the story where this all begins. September, the Labor Day weekend in 2020, Oregon was headed into a unique moment. We knew the weather was getting worse quickly, super dry conditions. We were in drought. We were heading into a series of thunderstorms that were going to come across from the coast into the valley, and it was brewing to be potentially very dangerous. Personally, I remember this. We were driving back from the Cascades from the long weekend, and you could just feel the moisture disappear from the atmosphere. The winds kicked up to real high levels, and we had this forecast knowing that we had significant wildland fire potential across the West. And then immediately, as I mentioned, thunderstorms moved through the area and kicked off a series of complexes of wildfires just outside the Portland metro area that in the end would burn 1 million acres, about the size of Rhode Island, and 20 of our 36 counties were affected in some way between burning, smoke, or evacuation orders. Structure loss, we were fortunate in many ways. It's still 5,000 structures were lost this period, but the fire remained primarily a rural impact. The urban impact was really the air quality challenges. That weekend, as the fire took off, the whole Portland metro region turned into this color of red. So we had 2 million people under conditions that just had never experienced before. The air quality impacts were enormous. And evacuation orders started off that weekend and built through the weekend. What's amazing here, what I'm showing on the screen here is here's the air quality. We were at that high point, that 480 for 3 days at that terrible hazardous category. The evacuation map you're seeing on the right hand here is the entirety of Clackamas County, which is one of our 3 metro counties here in Portland. The entire county was under some form of evacuation order, whether it was the ready, set, or go. And this presented a real challenge that will come up again later in our ESF 6 conversation, which was we're, as a state, we're planning for smaller type events when it comes to mass care. These might be flood events that impact 100 households, 200 households. But we've never had to deal with this question of how do you quickly care for an entire county where you had over 250,000 residents that had to find shelter somewhere. Now, I mentioned this is 2020, so the other backdrop here, of course, is that we were in the 6th or 7th month of the pandemic and still trying to figure out how to do congregate, non-congregate sheltering. How do you take care of folks in a mass care environment when we have all of these PPE and public health precautions in place for COVID-19? This fire, we were very lucky in many ways that we got through it the way we did. Our Department of Human Services was in charge of mass care for this event and really just had to be very nimble in the moment, figuring out how to get contracts cut with hotels, how to find temporary housing. But one of the big lessons that came out of this fire was the degree to which residents and communities were able to take care of themselves. In many ways, through informal networks, they were identifying fairgrounds, property that they could share, moving families, moving livestock and animals. And there was a good organic response to this fire. In the same period, we also had in 2021 a series of terrible wildfires in southern Oregon. Both of these events kicked off some awareness that community responses to these massive fire events just were not fitting. This first challenge was that they were not always meeting the culturally specific needs of communities. This was most notable where we had more diverse populations. The response teams weren't connecting, whether it was through language or cultural needs, to take care of different populations. We had some conflict among populations seeking assistance. And so there was a recognition that that one size fits all state governmental response wasn't the right approach. A lot of nonprofits and community-based organizations started making noise around this period saying, hey, we had some informal responses. We thought they were successful. We didn't know how to interface with the state, though, in order to be more successful. Can we think about how we bolster the capacity of community-based organizations, nonprofits, community groups, to allow them to really play more of a central role in this response and recovery process around wildfires in particular, but really any of the disaster events that we face here in Oregon? And this is a problem that's not uncommon for a lot of us who work in emergency management, right? We've moved over time from this very vertical command and control structure where we think there's sort of a way to direct and organize everything in one model. We've moved into this sort of partnership and federalism challenge where we've decentralized authority and funding and who plays a role. And even more recently, for those who are in the public administration and sociology world, where we've moved into this networked form of governance broadly in the U.S. So what I mean by that is that the county governments, especially here in Oregon, no longer maybe a direct service provider, but rather they're a contract manager. They're cooperating with nonprofits for health services, for mental health care, for different sanitation services. And so the delivery of public goods, of public services, is now distributed in a decentralized private public partnership model. Some of that's a response to the pressures of this federalism shift, right? We've moved authority to different places or we've cut support. And so we've gotten more creative. But it tells us that this network is the future. This is sort of what we're working with. And this project on the Oregon Resilience Hubs and Networks is trying to inject some more energy into that for organizations that may not always be part of that. So resilience hubs and networks popped up as the policy solution in some of these early conversations. And I think some of you are probably familiar with these ideas, and I know Hawaii has some great examples. Just to give you the ideal vision that was happening in the program here in Oregon was we wanted to identify groups, places, facilities that serve an everyday function, something that's already ingrained in the community that can then be enhanced to then pivot during disaster events to help support communities both in response and recovery. So really wanted to build on existing successes, find those champions, find those networks. And I'll talk a little bit about the challenges we ran into with that, but this was sort of the ideal model. You'll notice that the title here also has networks, and this was a really deliberate legislative choice in Oregon. The goal was, yes, we want to buy stuff, we want to invest in things, but we wanted to build social capital. The legislative debates here were really clear. They wanted to have a way to support nonprofits connecting with communities, for communities to connect with themselves, how to build better relationships across the state of Oregon, across counties. I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but I just want you to sort of dog-ear this in your mind. I'm going to think about 3 different types of social capital, and this really ties into those networks. We've got bonding social capital, and that's the type of social capital where we as a group become more of a group together. We've had some maybe adversity or some successes, and our identity as a group is stronger. Bridging social capital, and I think this is a lot of the work that was happening in this program, is how you take those well-bonded groups and then connect them with other groups in society. So maybe they're finding their own affinity groups elsewhere across geographies, or they're actually making cross-cultural connections, cross-community connections. And the last one, the linking social capital, I think of this as that institutional engagement. And that's probably not the best way to define something. Rather, linking social capital is the capacity for groups to engage governmental services, contracting, the mechanisms in those networks. And these three show up as we go through some of the requests from the Resilience Hubs program. So one of the other pieces that I want to make sure we capture here is we're trying to break the traditional model in this example. So the traditional mass care structure where we have one agency managing everybody's options, we want to decentralize. In this case, as I mentioned, Oregon Department of Human Services was the lead agency, but this massively outstripped their capacity. At the time of the 2020 fires, there was not a dedicated emergency management team within the Department of Human Services. This event led to the creation of what's known as the Office of Resilience and Emergency Management, or OREM, within Human Services. Even still, there's about a half dozen staff on that team, and they're managing. What's really important here to hang on to as well is Oregon Department of Human Services has a caseload clients in Oregon where 1 in 5 Oregonians somehow is receiving services through the Oregon Department of Human Services. So their clientele is enormous, 20% of the state. 6 people are managing that emergency management component. This is something that the fires and more recent events have really sort of underlined. We need to do more investment on how the agency has their capacity. Another dynamic, and this varies, of course, state by state. We have a particularly fragmented governance system in Oregon. This is part of our political culture here. We tend to distrust centralized government more than a lot of other states in Oregon. And so we tend to divide up duties across multiple agencies. So for us, when it comes to emergency management, these are the entities that are involved. I'm talking today about the work that Department of Human Services is providing, but we also have the OEM, Department of Emergency Management, Oregon Health Authority, and the Governor's State Resilience Officer. After action reports on recent fire season have underscored that these fragmentations are a challenge. Coordination has been a problem across responding to disasters. I'm going to note this here because it's sort of in the background, but it's a challenge we wrestle with in Oregon. And this is true of really many policy areas, fish and wildlife policy, natural resource policy. We divide up these responsibilities and it slows things down, but it is part of our cultural commitment or political cultural commitment here. So the Oregon Resilience Hubs comes from House Bill 2990, really trying to figure out how to engage non-traditional community-based organizations. So the Red Crosses of the world, our VOADs, all of those groups have the relationships, they've got plans. What was discovered during the fire event is that non-traditional groups were stepping into that space, whether it's faith-based groups that never thought about disaster response, whether it was agricultural groups and associations realizing they needed to play a role and help out, even sort of non-traditional groups like soccer clubs, music groups, like realizing that, hey, we have connections to individuals who need help. We're suddenly needing to think about how to do that work. And some of the seeds of this good work actually came out of our heat wave events in 2018, where our Oregon Department of Human Services really had to figure out how to do a lot more direct community engagement, and it worked best through traditional groups. So we get to this point where it's time to think about how to help people build their capacity in a resilient hub and network process. The grant program that the bill established set aside $10 million that would be granted out to really a diverse definition of organizations, and I'll talk about that here in a second, with the goal of developing capacity for those existing structures or facilities, and also building connections across groups. The Office of Resilience Emergency Management really did an amazing job. This is not something we did. We were not part of it, so I'm not trying to pat myself on the back. Their staff loaded up in a car and drove around the state for 4 months. They went from county to county to county saying, hey, come out, let us know what is it that a grant would help you with, and what is your capacity to apply for a grant. Through that listening tour, they developed a real low barrier grant application process. This was both a blessing and a curse for them and us as we evaluated it. When I say low barrier, really this was just an online web form that asked folks to check a couple of boxes, but largely there was not, if you've ever done a federal grant or state grant, there was no paperwork. The eligibility for organizations was wide open. Individuals could apply, private sector could apply. Really, there were no restrictions whatsoever. And the reason this was a blessing, of course, is it was easy for the applicants. The challenge on the back end is we had a lot of unstructured data. People were asking for really diverse sets of things, and it was hard to categorize that. And I'll talk a little bit about that more as we get into the data analysis here, but that was a challenge. Part of the grant had myself and a team of researchers on call for applicants. We would help them fill out these applications as well. And that was a little bit of a build it as you fly it challenge because the agency was also working on its guidance. But we did provide direct assistance to several hundred organizations, helping them think through their ideas, how to best make the case for their ideas. And so trying to inject some capacity there as well. 700 applications came in. So there were over $176 million in requests and just $10 million to hand out. One other piece that was utilized here that was an interesting challenge was the application was embedded in an ArcGIS application. As individuals filled it out, if you ever used Survey 123 from Esri, that's what was being used. So the applicants were filling out their data in a geospatial application because in the back end, the Department of Human Services was using the Environmental Protection Agency's EJ screen and some measures of rurality to then assign objective scores to each of the applicants. Applicants then were able to be rated based on where they were on the landscape, what EJ communities they were serving or would benefit from the investment, also how rural were the areas. One of the things we learned very quickly, applicants figured that out. And it wasn't wrong, but they started thinking about where was the best place to sort of drop the pin for their grant application. So if they had a large service area that might include more affluent and poor areas, many groups realized, well, the wise thing to do here is sort of make our address on this side of the geography. I don't think anybody was, playing shenanigans per se, but there was an element of strategy there. Which groups, which areas do you want to sort of represent that you're from to help out with that? The data from these applications themselves was really one of the first important outcomes that came from this work because it identified groups that the Oregon Department of Human Services had never heard of before. And so in some ways, even without handing out the money yet, there was already this new level of awareness of, oh, all of these groups out here think they could have a role in disaster response and recovery. We've never talked to them before. Now we're able to survey them, engage them, and see actually what they're asking for. The last bullet here really was key. We had some open-ended codes that we had to work with. So we had a lot of open-ended data that came in. So this is where folks were typing in what they wanted and why they wanted it and their justifications. And then we were doing coding work on my side. I was lucky to have a small army of grad students to help me with this. And I'll share what some of those findings are here in just a moment. We were fortunate. We were worried about where we would hear about applications or where applicants across the state would show up. We had a pretty good geographical distribution here. Community-based organizations, by and large, were the biggest set of applicants, followed by public organizations, which were largely special districts like school districts and municipalities. We did have some private organizations. Some folks saw this as an opportunity as seed funding for doing private innovations or designing new technologies. One of my favorites, there was a game manufacturer that applied that was going to create a card game for resilience. And so some really creative ideas came out here. We also had some pretty outlandish requests, some small fire districts asking for aviation assets, things that sort of were out of bounds. But we had a real diverse set of requests across the board. Out of that 176 million that were requested, most of it was going to equipment. And I'm going to talk about this in a second. We have two types of equipment broken out here, just sort of general equipment, and then something called typed packages. I'll talk about the typed packages in a second because that was a unique innovation for this program. But equipment was the big driver. And in part, that was by design within the application of the grant program. Structural improvements were limited to about $20,000. So there were no real capital costs that could be included. Staffing was the next big category, along with some of the operational expenses, which included things like insurance, utilities, so really literally keeping the lights on for some of these organizations. But the way this was designed, we heard a lot on the equipment. Now, the type packages were an interesting model here. Early on in the grant process, back to that idea of trying to keep this a low barrier program, the Department of Human Services said, we should try to make this easier for folks. Don't have everybody researching all these different things they might want to invest in. Let's give them a menu. So I'm giving you here on the screen sort of a snapshot of what one of those menus looked like. There were 5 sizes of these typed packages. Essentially, we can think of a typed package as just a Connex box full of goodies. So these big trailer boxes, right? Cargo boxes, loaded up with generators, water, you name it. there was this huge spreadsheet, which I'm just giving you a little snippet of here, that let folks decide what they wanted to apply for. They could pick one or many of these, and it was meant to standardize and help speed up the process. And I think it was received well. One of the challenges we ran into with the site packages, just to give you a sense here of what they look like, site preparation and utility access was something that wasn't 100% understood early on. And so some of the applicants later on had to wrestle with that, sort of leveling out the space and grading it and making sure that the utilities were dropped to the site. A lot of the type packages have been developed and distributed here in Oregon. So there's an economic development story here for a new contractor who's outfitting these and has now some expertise around this. And hopefully this is a model that can be replicated down the road. Here's a breakout of what we heard from the application data itself. So, there was some variation across these patterns. Community-based organizations really were more likely to be asking about staffing versus any building costs, where our public entities were asking for building improvements of different types. And some of those include power pieces, drainage, some other questions, but you see the differentiation there in terms of what they're asking for. Now, remember, I'm showing these as percentages, and so it sort of makes everyone look equal in terms of size. But remember, community-based organizations were the biggest group. And so if I take all the items that they were requesting and stack them up, this gives you a sense of just how much more the CBOs, the community-based organizations, were asking for pieces, and how much staffing just dwarfs all of these other categories. So there was a lesson here that really helped us as we were talking for the next round of grants, think through how can we help folks think about the staffing challenge. And especially in light of that model of thinking about resilience hubs and networks, how do we do that social capital work? The stuff and the equipment is maybe less the barrier. And rather, when we were looking at the open-ended side of things, it was more about hiring individuals or making volunteers finally professionalized, like they can actually do this work for pay. That would be the investment that would help out in terms of creating more social capital across groups. Now, the other fun part here, and I say fun in the sense of, when you're struggling with a ton of data, we had a number of essays. I say essays, but think about 4 or 5 paragraphs across the whole application of some open-ended questions about how the group would serve vulnerable populations, how they would help out with resilience, what the issues were that we're addressing. And we coded these as a team, and really a number of themes popped out. Communications and networks really jumped out high, and with that connection to bridging and linking. So folks were saying, hey, we want to hire someone to help us coordinate with state and county government. We want to hire somebody to create a new network that meets 3 times a year and connects organizations. That connectivity was really where a lot of the staffing requests were coming from. The networks were also identifying sort of a need for self-sufficiency. So a lot of the grant applications were talking about how they could build their own capacity and focusing on that. On the operations categories, we definitely heard structures and buildings were a priority. The grant didn't allow it, so that definitely tamped down what we heard. What we did hear here was that power systems were the next component. So how to be sustainable off the grid, go through events. Staffing sometimes snuck in here. That was always a challenge with our unstructured grant application is while we had categories, folks weren't really enforced on following those rules. And so we had in the back end move classifications around. We did hear about direct service provisioning also as something that folks wanted to fund, and community building events. So a lot of workshops, events, fairs, those were the types of open networking components that also popped up here. And then when it comes to the vulnerable populations, we went through and analyzed who they aimed at serving. And we did see that there was a lot of interest and expressed desire to address particularly low-income households, but then also lots of groups that had functional needs requirements. They were applying along with some older adult organizations as well. So we were heartened by this that, considering Oregon's makeup, we really had a high representation here for folks who wanted to do good vulnerable population service through these grants. In the end, the state funded the 10 million, was able to do mostly with the type packages and some other direct support. It was a challenge on getting down to that smaller number. And one of the projects we have down the road we hope to do is a survey of both those that were funded and those that weren't to see how they are doing now, how this helped. We did survey during this project, actually, just before the awards went out. And one of the great pieces that came out of this is of the 700, we heard back from about 300 applicants And overall, they were pretty satisfied with the process. What you're seeing here is a series of measures of satisfaction with how to go through and fill out the application. Pretty positive across the board. Some challenges on filling out the form because it didn't have a save feature and some other technical pieces, and that's probably one place where they were rated lower. But still, everything here is above 70%. One other question we asked about was their own capacity and experience with grants, and almost half of those that responded to the survey really had never had much grant experience before. So this low barrier model really did help out in terms of getting groups in the door and letting them try at least to pursue these funds. Now, the exciting piece is Oregon Department of Human Services has this catalog of emergent organizations. So for those of you who work in the nonprofit space with disasters, right, we know there's these ad hoc and emergent organizations. Prior to a disaster, we don't know how to find them necessarily. They show up in a disaster response context. This grant was a stimulus. It was sort of like dropping some dye in the water and seeing where it goes. And we identified new groups, new organizations that we otherwise wouldn't have known. Also able to make an enormous case to the legislature. Look, we had 10 million to give, 176 million was requested, and here's what they were asking for. This last bullet, really a neat innovation. The OREM team set aside money to hire a grant writing team of 4 who worked through the list of folks who didn't get funded and gave them grant paperwork to go apply for different federal and state grants elsewhere. They actually leveraged almost as much money in possible grant funding as what was given through this program. So another creative solution here to help build capacity and also find other funding sources to fill out what this program had. So, I'm going to shift a moment over to ES6, but for the resilience hubs and networks, I'm really excited about this program because it is this bottom-up decentralized engagement. It's grantee-led, and so they helped structure how the grant would be designed, how it should be evaluated, what to apply for. Really a neat model for thinking about public grants. That lower barrier is great for participation, and the warning for agencies that want to engage this is invest in the back end. You're going to have to use more staff time to analyze this and make sense of it. And then the other piece is I got to do this, so I'm excited about it. But this engagement monitoring, we had a chance to do the surveys and provide technical assistance. So really had a pulse on like what these different communities were wrestling with and what they were able to do. So that's the resilience hubs and networks story. At the moment, we have not had it re-upped for funding yet. I actually need to check on the agency. We just closed out our short session. I think there's a chance going forward. It's still on the books as a program. As many of you all know, we're struggling with a really tough budget environment with the changes in federal funding. But I'm hopeful that when those winds shift again, we at least have this infrastructure to re-engage this. Okay, let's talk about ESF6. This is not always the most exciting or well-known topic, but this is the mass care planning function in the emergency support functions. Let me share with you, this is the Oregon ESF, but this mirrors a lot of what other states and FEMA would incorporate. Just to remind you, ESF6 is the mass care, and it was primarily focused on these 4 target areas, right? We're doing feeding and sheltering and distribution of supplies along with reunification, coordinating volunteers and material, helping out with housing, and then also counseling, financial assistance, case management. Case management in this case was actually has always been a challenge because there's so many folks that quickly showed up in that fire season into the system, and being able to manage all of those individuals was technologically a challenge. So why did this come up? So the state recognized their own challenges with ESF6. I showed you that map of all Clackamas County being up for evacuation. They recognized their county partners were also really struggling with this. Mass care plans, county by county, were really uncoordinated. They weren't sure if they actually covered any applicable policy choices, and they weren't sure what was going on at the county level. So we decided, hey, let's do a plan quality evaluation. For those of you who are familiar with the space, this is a great bit of work that's been done in the planning literature. And in fact, if you've taken the disaster recovery course, you've even participated in it because we use that as an exercise in the course. What we did here is we collected all of the available mass care plans that we could find in Oregon, developed a code book, and I'll talk about that in a second, coded it in teams, and then I'll share the data results from that. But it gave us a sense of where each county is in terms of performing on what were identified as key policy areas for ESF6. a real tension here that we had was trying to make sure that we weren't doing ABCD grading. No one wanted to get an F, no one wanted to get called out. And so we were always stressing that these were relative measures, but you'll definitely see that there's sort of high and low performers when I share some of these data. So there's the FEMA, the doctrinal guidance on how to do ESF 6, but we also wanted to pull in, this was something the Department of Human Services was really pushing for, a more inclusive and equity-driven model. And so we use this Disaster Human Services Capabilities Playbook from 2023 to create a code book that expanded on those traditional categories. Later on, if any of you are interested, feel free to shoot me an email. I can share with you these documents. We ended up with these 6 categories that we evaluated every plan along. The first one is about how well leadership is set up for ESF 6, who's in charge and who can drive it. Then the next category is how well they're using data and evidence to really inform which populations need their assistance. Do the plans talk about equity? What are the coordination and communication mechanisms, in part across ESF 6s or other ESFs or other agencies? Staffing is what the surge category really is here. Are they able to rely on other resources in other parts of the county to really make this happen? And then is there a monitoring and evaluation component? And the core mission then, the last one, captures those key ESF 6 plan elements. Now, don't read this at all, but it's to give you a sense of sort of what the challenge was here. This is the first capability, coalition building capacity. This is the code book that a team of 3 grad students and myself negotiated out over the course of a month of reading plans. Within the capability, then we identified a series of 6 scoring elements. And then we decided, all right, fully developed gets a number 3, missing is 0, and then in between, here's what you want to look for in the plan. Really challenging on that intercoder reliability. When each team member came back with their plan, we all double coded, so we had another partner to talk to. What we ended up doing was negotiating. So for every plan that was coded, we sat down and said, okay, 1.2, what did you give it? Well, Paul says, I had a 2, and it was because I highlighted these passages. I know my colleague Richmond, I had a 0. I couldn't find them. Let's talk about that. And we would say, okay, yes, this is a 2, or maybe Paul overestimated it and it should be a 1. And that's what we did for all of the plans across all of these capabilities. We have some ideas on innovations on how to modernize that. I'll talk about at the end. Some of the challenges here, it was just a lot of negotiating the terminologies and getting a sense of what in text means what in the code book. The other challenge, and I think this is a classic planning problem in our disaster world, plans of plans. So a lot of ESF 6 documents might say, oh, go look in this other planning document for this section, and we're not going to talk about it. Well, we were really worried, and we gave them sort of a 1 for that, but we wanted the ESF 6 documents as much as they could to stand alone, with the idea that this might be something that gets handed to a planner, a decision maker, a community partner. And that sort of go look at another plan to find guidance is problematic. Things get out of date. In fact, we found in some cases the wrong versions were available online. So we wanted to see it incorporated in a standalone plan as much as possible. And then the overlapping mission, sort of where does ESF 6 stop and start, especially around evacuation? That was a constant challenge. So in Oregon, here is a map of the state, and in green are the counties that had an ESF 6 plan available. So the first aha here, of course, was we've got 12 counties that don't have a document, or we're unwilling to share it, or we're not making it publicly available. So that's interesting to begin with, that we don't have those documents. We also included 2 tribes, the Umatilla and Warm Springs Confederated tribes. They both had plans, and we actually did some interviews as well with tribes to explore their unique needs around ESF 6. So the first thing we do, I'm a data guy. So I'm like, all right, let's look at how the age of these plans are. Maybe that predicts things. We didn't find that plan quality was driven by age very much. Pretty broad distribution here because we don't have a ton. There was a big spike of activity right after wildfire season. The other thing we were keeping an eye on is who wrote the plans. What you're seeing here is basically 3 consulting firms or the county themselves. One consulting firm in particular having the bulk of the plans. And I'll come back to some of the evaluations on that later. So here's the scores across that and distributed. So we've got sort of from the lower performing on the left to the higher performing on the right, being careful, I wasn't supposed to say that out loud. But we do definitely see variation, actually sort of a nice distribution of variation. So for my stats friends out there, we get excited about what we might be able to do with these data. I'll skip that piece. Here is the real nugget of what we were able to do then. So because we had all of those scores on all of those dimensions, we were able to sit down with our partners and say, okay, this is what all of Oregon looks like when I average all of those plans. We're seeing the core mission and coalition building and learning are talked about, but we're worried that there's not a decision-making set of guidance in these plans, and disaster equity came out low, almost no surge in staffing conversation. So we're automatically able to sort of say statewide, here are some weak areas in the plans that we could do some improvement. But then we also said, that's the average. You've got high performers in all of these dimensions. What can you take from them to learn about those dimensions? And I'll step through some examples of these. We definitely had some folks, if you remember back here, the equity piece was very low, maybe the plan decision making, but we did have some higher performing ones where, Clatsop County, which is one of our coastal communities, really did a great job thinking about how decision making would occur. And they talked extensively about their population, disaster equity, and how they would do inclusive work. These three dimensions are what jump out for us because they're the ones that need improvement, but also where we have some high performers we can borrow from. So let me just give you a little tour of the state, and then I'll be able to wrap this up here. So Eastern Oregon, we had about a half dozen plans. Very similar, but just, what I want you to take away from this is that in a region facing both similar demographic profile and hazard profiles, we have a fair bit of variation here, Malheur versus Morrow, primarily based on how much investment was able to be made into the planning process. Some definite structures are patterned here. Baker and Union and Harney have a somewhat similar shape, but even within these similar places, some variation. Central Oregon, as we move towards the metro area, Deschutes County is where Bend is, which is sort of inside the lower left part of the circle here, a little more affluent. And in Deschutes, that's where we see some really different conversations going on. So Deschutes County spending a lot more time on their disaster equity component and their coordination and communication, two areas that we identified as weaker across the state. And then the rest of the region, sort of in a different story, a little more constrained and scoring lower. The Portland metro area is where we saw a real shift towards coordination and communication, which makes a lot of sense. Here, just the landscape around the metro area requires a lot of coordination. And our land use and transportation planning systems have been integrated for 30, 40 years. And so those connections are there as well. As we move down the valley into our agricultural communities, Yamhill really stood out. This was a plan that was one of the newer ones, and they invested a lot more energy through their partners talking about all the things that we had been sort of looking for in the scoring. So they had extensive drilling and exercise components and how they do outreach to communities on learning and evaluation. Willamette Valley really very greatly. Marion County, we were a little bit surprised to see it as narrow as it was. That is where Salem, our capital, is. And so their county emergency managers tend to have a better connection with state planners. And it's not showing up, at least in this document. Okay, last couple categories here are coastal communities, Southern Oregon. I mentioned Clatsop. This was a high performer on the decision-making and disaster equity. And then Columbia County, this is an example of a plan that was really just like a 5-page document borrowed from another county. And so it scored very low on this. It was a little bit of a wrinkle. The author of that plan was one of our reviewers. And so we always said sort of, hey, we know you did this quickly and you had to do it this way, but it definitely didn't score very high. And that was some of the politics of that co-production. And then finally, let me share with you the two tribal nations that we were able to evaluate. The Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs on the left and Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation on the right. The Umatilla story was primarily smaller just because a lot of it deferred to BIA and federal responses, and there wasn't a lot of connectivity sort of off reservation support. Warm Springs had a much bigger conversation about sort of where their people were and how they would respond. I'll say for the tribal documents in interviews that I conducted as a part of this process, tribes are doing the documents, but the real work is not written down, and they have extensive partnership agreements and practices to take care of their folks working with other tribes across state lines. So there's something also not being captured in these plan documents that's happening within practice. I'll share just a couple of final scoring pieces here that I think are sort of interesting to hang on to. What we're seeing here is the scoring by region for each of these. And so what really jumps out, Central Oregon, that's Deschutes, is really driving some high performer examples here. The Portland metro region is another set of high performers. And then the Willamette Valley, that's our Yamhill case. So those three areas really drive a lot of sort of what we saw as the best options out there. This is, sort of a fun question here. Do consulting firms change the quality of these plans? What we see here is one consulting firm, because they did the Yamhill and a couple other plans, stood out. More of my takeaway here is it looks like when counties do their own planning process, they struggle a little bit more. And I don't know, this is sort of a causation challenge here, right? It might be that counties that have money that could invest in it in their own people realize they'll just invest it. It's more efficient to invest it in an outside consultant. So, is it resources? Is it the consultant? Which one is which? It's probably a resource story. And if you have the resources, you're able to contract out and pull in that expertise. But it does tell us that sort of if counties are taking this on, they need some more support. The final piece of this project that's still under development is then taking all of these lessons, conducting interviews in 2 pilot counties. And so far, we've got about a half dozen in one and a dozen in another with CBOs that have never formally been engaged in ESF6. How can we help them get involved? How can we take the lessons from these planning processes and help build? We know there's a strong social fabric out there. How do we tie it to these planning processes, tie it to the county, do the coordination and convening, and try to help folks out? I will say one of the big in the background challenges for ESF6, the mass care work in Oregon, is the housing crisis we're facing. And I don't think this is unique to Oregon. When we say the word shelter in a lot of our policy discourse here, people immediately think of the unhoused, particularly in public spaces on a day-to-day process. We had a hard time getting a lot of organizations to pause and think about sheltering from the perspective of massive disaster event where no one has an option. But this is a warning for folks doing ESF6 work. Our current housing crisis is really coloring the options and biasing how folks engage this policy issue, and that's a challenge. And I don't know if we need to find some new terminology or do some more education and outreach, but that's really been a barrier here. When we start talking about sheltering, the politics of it get very complex. Finally, this was a code development process. We have the code book now that we want to play with a bit further. We have some outline plans for our partners. Going forward, what I really want to do is I think that this is a great application for generative artificial intelligence. I have a colleague who's been using this in other cases, but I'd like to train one of our models to take that coding work and then be able to ingest more plans more quickly. There's some good evidence that that's actually a much more successful way to do the qualitative coding, and then develop from that a best practices guide. All right, I'm mindful. I have been talking for a bit here, and I want to stop with this. But let me leave this slide up for a moment. If you want to get in touch with me, you can either contact the team here or shoot me an email. But happy to take some questions at this point. And I see the chat has got a little red bubble, so we can take a look there too.
That's mostly me from my report out earlier, but thank you
Oh,
so
good,
much,
good.
Paul. It's really refreshing to see these initiatives from the inception and to see the results from that. So thank you. I do have a quick question. I will go selfishly go first. This is more in terms of the first part of the presentation for the resilience hubs and more about retainment. You mentioned training the volunteers to become certified and to become professionals. As these response systems become more decentralized and you're including all these maybe non-traditional groups or volunteers, how does this tie into the emergency management systems for that long-term capacity and accountability and retention? And have you seen these emerging groups being able to sustain their efforts so far?
So the first part of your question, I think it's a really interesting one that we don't know yet because we're bringing in groups that they don't even know the language necessarily of emergency management or disaster planning. And so there's an educational curve here, definitely. The Department of Human Services was much more motivated to see them included in the process versus worrying about them being fully integrated to the sort of training and those components around disaster management or emergency management. So I think that's going to be the next generation for the folks who do successfully stay a part of this. Though then there's going to be some support for them as well. A lot of those comments that we heard about that staffing and professionalization of trainers, volunteers is folks are going to be in this space regardless. It's a passion project. They're doing the volunteer work. They're part of the community group. And so thinking about how to creatively give them opportunities to learn some of these pieces and do that coordination. And I think that is something to be done down the road. The staying power question you have, I want to know next. That's actually what we need to do next is some survey work because if now has been a full year, the grant funding went out a year later than they expected. And so there's a bit of a delay there. And so we're letting that sit and see what happens. But that's the next piece for us research wise. All right. Folks who did get the funding, how are you doing? Actually, I want to go back to the folks who didn't get funding and ask them if they found alternatives or if they're still here with us, or was that sort of like their one chance? But we don't know quite yet on that one.
Great. Well, that's good foundation, good groundwork. I was also wondering about the ones who had little grant experience and they were able to get some. So this is great. I will stop talking now. Does anybody else have any other questions? Please feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Okay. Last chance for questions. Okay, I do have another one.
Go for it. Let's go.
Again, I'm really interested in resilience hubs, so I was really engaged. So my question is to the applicants that had the little or no prior grant experience, how or what was the most effective to getting them to actually apply? I know a lot of for NGOs, these grant experiences can be maybe dramatic to say, but maybe a little traumatic and maybe a little bit of we don't want to do it, put this time and effort into it for something that might not come through. But what was that most engaging for those participants that don't have a lot of experience?
Good question. So I think there's two things. One is really keeping the application simple, right? So this document didn't have a lot of complex questions. The place though I think that really helped move the ball was having a technical assistance program. So on the website, so the way this was unfolded was there was a series of listening sessions I mentioned. After that, the OREM team did a bunch of webinars and went back out to the community and said, here's how you apply. And they try to answer questions and try to help folks out there. But immediately, the first step in applying for the grant was just being shared the information that, hey, you can contact this team at Portland State University, and they will literally work through it with you. And so what my team did was really take ideas from these partners and try to help turn them into grant appropriate language, right? So we sort of tried to be not quite their grant writer, but really help them with that. And so I think in that sense, a lot of the groups that contacted us, they had a good idea, they had a spark, they didn't know quite which way it should go. And so we'd say, okay, here's how you're going to be evaluated. Here's what the state policy is really worried about, and here's how you can address it. Here's what the scoring looks like, and how you can think about that. And so we really try to have that sort of more human approach to really help out folks and guide them through that. So if you were a low capacity organization, you had a chance to really make a go at this without it burning you out or keeping you up at night.
Right. For the technical assistance, did you have a lot of participation in that with these grants?
Yeah, so
I
out of the 700 applications, I think we directly helped 190.
Ooh, nice. Carl, I saw that you turned your camera on. Did you want to add something?
Well, I wanted to thank Paul for a very interesting presentation. And, I had two thoughts or reactions. So oftentimes when we think about hubs, we think about a physical place or a location or a community. And a lot of times we're trying to think about pre-staging, materials or resources, or this seems a little different from that thinking. Or is there a way to kind of accommodate more physical or place-based, you know, assets and needs and in this program as well, right? Or it seems more about networking and building communications capabilities and sharing technical abilities, which I think is really needed. But when I think about hubs, I tend to think about
Mhm.
a physical
Yeah,
spatial location, right?
yeah. So this was a fun challenge. So the stuff was definitely key here. So those
Yeah.
tight packages were one of the biggest categories of actually what was put out on the ground. So caches were definitely part of this.
Mhm.
Their improvements to the structures. Here's the interesting challenge. And this is so if anyone is engaged in this at the legislative level or policymaking level, there was an awareness that the state didn't want to fund entities that probably should fund themselves elsewhere. So one of the first things that, first groups that immediately started applying were volunteer fire districts and asking for more gear. And
Yeah.
that was sort of quickly, no, 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 that's not quite what we're trying to do here. You're already plugged in, or you should be plugged in elsewhere. And the same piece with the buildings. I think the challenge on the structures was a recognition that with $10 million, you could very quickly drain that on one or two capital projects.
Right.
So in this conversation, the goal was really to try to figure out how do we seed these really small organizations that are emergent. They really are emergent. They don't necessarily have the space or place quite yet, but we want to give them a shot because the perception, at least in the policy process, was some of these actors that have space, the facilities, are already doing an okay job of attracting resources. How do we help the folks that we found through the fire experience were sort of more ad hoc or emergent, and help them mature into the next piece? An example out here on the east side, especially, was the fairgrounds played a critical role in the wildfire seasons for the past 4 years. So that's a place where folks could easily get animals out to. They could park the trailer there regardless. The sort of space was there. There are some west side politics that were a little less excited about investing in fairgrounds for some perceptions around like these are things that should already be sort of viable on their own. So that was, when it comes to the hubs in the policy conversation, there was some tiptoeing around sort of perceptions of who deserves a little bit more, who deserves a little bit less, and what's most effective. So, Carl, I think at the end of the process here, a lot of those caches were the driver.
Mhm.
But when you opened it up to sort of hear what folks wanted, staffing, especially for the nonprofit, staffing was the thing that they really needed.
Yeah, and so what I'm gonna open up a challenge to all of our NDPTC staff to think about where these ideas fit in terms of our curriculum, our training, and the work that we're doing, right? And because I see connections to the different coursework that we're doing, but sort of figuring out where it would fit best and how this experience would augment our training and capacity building. I mean, some of it relates to communications too. And then I think also there may be other specialized functions related to damage assessment, debris management, recovery planning, as well as all the mitigation stuff as well too, right? And so, but interesting work, and thank you very much for. I'm sure there'll be more follow-up uh, and more inquiries about the good experience that you're sharing with us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Mhm.
Of course. Thank you so much, Paul. You can view this presentation as well as all of our past presentations on our YouTube channel. We have a specific playlist for Third Thursday. And with that, thank you for coming. We hope to see you next time. Enjoy the rest of your day.